Hello once again. Today's topic for ethics in physical activity and health will be medical and bioethics. So let's get started. Of course, let's make sure everyone's on the same page. Bioethics is the study of controversial topics brought about by advances in biology or medicine. So if you think about that definition, it's broad, it's large, and it's ever changing. Because as we go along, we definitely have technology and medical advances every day, and so this is an ever-changing field that includes many different areas. So I'll give you some examples. Debates over boundaries of life, meaning, when does life begin and when does life end? That may seem straightforward. I assure you it certainly is not. So those topics of abortion or euthanasia really drive home, how do you believe or what do you believe about boundaries of life? So we'll talk about that here in a second. Certainly biotechnology, but other areas too that aren't just advances in biology or medicine, but the allocation of healthcare resources, as an example, meaning who gets what. Medical care takes money, and it takes time, and it takes highly trained individuals. So how do you allocate that amongst the general population? Also, the topic of right to refusal of healthcare. And then, of course, I'll mention a few research studies since we are talking about, of course, advances in biology or medicine. So debates over boundaries of life. Obviously, I suppose the one that you probably thought of first was abortion. Abortion, of course, being the termination of a fetus. Now, abortion is, this class is not, you could have a whole semester, honestly, about the ethical considerations of abortion. And so that is beyond, or a little bit, we need to keep this very focused. But, abortion can be thought of in a couple different ways. First, let me mention that it is legal to some degree in every state, and abortion is actually it's governed at the state level, and so because of that, you do have to look into state laws regarding abortion, but it is legal. Usually, the difference between the states is going to be at what point in a pregnancy can you abort a fetus. In some states, that is very, very early. In some states, it is later than others. But I think if you want to really make a decision on how you stand about this, thinking about when you believe life begins is a good place to start. Because that's what we're talking about here, the boundaries of life. When does life begin? So if you believe that life begins immediately upon conception, then perhaps abortion you will not be in favor of any kind of abortion. Or maybe you believe that life begins when a human can sustain its own life. Obviously, very, very young fetuses cannot. They have to be in the womb. And so maybe you are okay with what most people would say, pro-choice. So maybe you're pro-choice versus what the opposing view would be pro-life, and so on. So it is a tough subject, but it does come down to about when does life begin. Other topics within boundaries of life include things like sterilization. This can be elective sterilization or forced sterilization, which does still happen in cultures around the world. And there has been cases even recently of forced sterilization within the prison system in the U.S. How do you feel about that? I gave you a link here to read about, I believe it's a CBS News article, on wrongful birth, which is, we are able to do some screenings now when children or fetuses are in the womb. And wrongful birth is actually, it's a legal term, where if you feel like your healthcare provider did not provide you with potential life-altering information, that you can sue a physician for wrongful birth. Meaning, if your son or daughter has was going to have Down syndrome, you can tell that during pregnancy. And so some individuals actually will sue for wrongful birth. And that's why I wanted to provide an article, because it's not an easy thing, I guess, for me to explain. But it helps give you an example of when this happens. Of course, like I said, the beginning of life and conception, that is probably your boundary of life. When do you believe life begins? And then we'll take it to the other side where we're talking about end-of-life dilemmas, or these are ethical dilemmas. Euthanasia, meaning the taking of a life to end suffering. Advanced directives, which include things like DNRs down there. So it's as an example of an advanced directive, and there are others. Futility of treatment, meaning when do we decide to stop treating somebody? When we know that they're terminal, when we know that we can no longer cure them, when they say they want to stop treatment, withdrawal of treatment. So again, when do we stop this? And then those advanced directives. To give you an example, about a boundary of life case, a very, very famous case, if you haven't heard of it before, you probably have, was the Terri Schiavo case. So this is dating, myself quite a bit, so you probably don't remember this, but I actually do. So in 1990, Terri Schiavo collapsed in full cardiac arrest when she was only 27 years old. So obviously extremely rare occurrence for a woman her age. Because of that cardiac arrest and the lack of oxygen to her brain, she had severe brain damage and was declared to be in a persistent vegetative state. So she was able to maintain some bodily functions. Other things she could not do, like feed herself. So she had a feeding tube. But she was not dead, in our sense of the term dead, as if not having any, physiological actions. But 8 years later, her husband, declared that she wasn't living her life. This obviously was not the same woman. She was not living life. And so he asked for her feeding tube to be removed in 1998, which is actually called passive euthanasia. So she would ultimately die from not having any nourishment. That is called passive euthanasia, and it is legal in all 50 states. And so her husband asked for this, and he has actually authority to ask for that as her spouse, as her legal spouse, because she did not have any will or any advanced directives in place, which is very common for someone who's 27 years old. So a Florida court, where they were at, agreed, and they removed the feeding tube in 2001, but her parents disagreed and did not, they wanted to keep her alive, and they argued the opposite. They argued that she was still alive, and they even felt that she had some cognitive ability, and so they thought she was blinking, to communicate and such. So a very different perspective there. So her parents disagreed, took it to court, and so it was reinserted. The feeding tube was a few days later. This became a major national news story for a variety of reasons. There were several appeals and actually even government intervention that followed, which is very unusual in some of these cases. And so ultimately, though, what happened was, so during all of these years, 4 years actually worth, well, if you count 1998, so 7 years worth of debate and legal actions, 14 appeals and motions, petitions, hearings about the boundaries of life. Is this the end of life? And who has the right to make that decision? So after all of this, for all these years, the Florida Appeals Court actually upheld the original decision, and her feeding tube was removed on March 18th, 2005, and she died a couple weeks later, March 31st. So down there in the right-hand corner was her after her brain damage. And so you can see she does have eyes open. Like I mentioned, her parents felt that she was blinking to communicate. There's no evidence that that was true, but she was unable to do most things on her own. At most things, meaning, anything besides breathing, because obviously she doesn't have a breathing tube here. So that's the only thing she could do. And so it's just a really, like I said, an eye-opening case of the two sides of these boundaries of life. Yes, she's living her life, or no, she's not. And the court agreed with the husband, who actually ended up having, like I said, he has legal decision-making authority as her spouse. So moving on, biotechnology can include things like cloning, which is very common, actually, in our world. Lots of animals are cloned nowadays. And you can pay to have your, like your beloved dog cloned. Gene therapy, so this would be something like modifying your genes in order for them to be expressed differently. This is happening, but not on a wide scale. Life extension, certainly we can do this. Obviously, we can put people on life-sustaining machinery and keep them physiologically alive. We can keep their heart beating, we can keep them breathing, we can feed them through a feeding tube. Human engineering, if you've ever seen the movie Gattaca, it's probably one of the most famous about, altering genes. And life in space. And there's lots of research conducted, and exercise physiologists actually are employed by NASA to study the effects of the human, or space and zero gravity on the human body. And one of the most famous ones recently was with the Kelly twins, the gentlemen who are both astronauts, and one lived in space for a long time. I believe it was almost a year. And they did lots of research using the two twins because their DNA was identical. And they found some changes for the individual who was living in space. So really interesting stuff. So for reflection question 2, and the full prompt is in the syllabus, but I want you to think about this. If you could engineer a human, would you? Check out the full prompt, think about it, and write some thoughts down for me. Related to biotechnology, we've got an example case, the Jesse Gelsinger case. In 1999, he became the first. He was a young man who voluntarily enrolled. But in 1999, he became the first subject in a gene transfer clinical trial to die. And remember our earlier discussion about research. There are risks and there are benefits. He had I can't remember what it's called now, but in your NIH online training, I think you read about this case. So there are always risks and benefits to research. And sometimes people die when they are enrolled in research. He voluntarily enrolled. So what was the problem? What was the real problem here? Obviously, besides, him dying, I'm talking about what's the ethical dilemma here? Well, when that happens, obviously we investigate, and that's a good thing that we investigate. But the Gelsinger case revealed that he had prior to doing the gene transfer, he had high ammonia levels, and that should have been criteria to exclude him from the trial. He actually was not considered healthy enough, probably, to participate in the clinical trial. There was failure by the university that ran the study to report that 2 patients had experienced serious side effects from the gene therapy, and that there had been, because before you ever have human trials, you have animal trials, there was failure to disclose that there had been death of monkeys in a similar treatment, and that should have been in the informed consent document. So if you're looking at the 4 components of informed consent, disclosure was not met. So he may have been competent, he may have done this voluntarily, but then when you fall back on those 4 components, disclosure was not there, and therefore he probably did not understand all of the risks and benefits. So it may have altered his decision to participate. It may not have, but we don't know. And then finally, the principal investigator actually had a big conflict of interest. So if you'll remember, a conflict of interest is when a researcher has something to gain or lose by the results of a research study. So the PI in this case was an inventor for the technology. So he invented it and held equity in the startup company that was doing the gene therapy. So there's a huge conflict of interest, and maybe that's why this is a very rare disease he had. So maybe that clouded his judgment. So these are the 4 main ethical issues that were revealed when this case was investigated. So this still happens today, right? We talked about things that happened, over 100 years ago and within the last 100 years, but this was 1999. Some of you are probably alive in 1999. Most of you, actually. So that's just, again, some sampling, if you will, of bioethics. I don't want to, ignore them. It's such a huge topic. So let's go ahead now and look at a little bit more medical ethics. Medical ethics being then, obviously it would be considered within bioethics, but medical ethics now we're talking directly about medical care or providing medical care. The first topic to think about is allocation of healthcare resources, meaning, resources aren't just money. It's also equipment, individuals, time, places, facilities. So we have, if you look at 2 overarching healthcare models, both are present in society today. So it's not like one of them is the only one around. But the 2 healthcare models, overarching healthcare models, are reactive or disease-oriented, which is where you wait until you get sick and then you seek help. And sometimes that's completely necessary in accidents, like you sprain your ankle or you break your arm. You can actually do a lot to prevent those things, depending on, wearing your seatbelt, if we're talking about driving in a car and such. But there are some things that happen that you have to go and get fixed. Cold and flu. You don't necessarily have to go to a doctor for that. I'm just giving examples where sometimes, even when you try to prevent something, you will need to seek medical care. And that's not that it's not okay. However, the problem with reactive disease-oriented models is that most of the things that the U.S. is dealing with are chronic diseases. And in that case, it is a much better idea to use the proactive, preventative, wellness-oriented model. So you want to take actions to reduce the chances of getting sick. And we see this too. There are a lot of people or a lot of medical facilities that take a more proactive approach and try to do a more proactive approach. So the current healthcare system, like I said, is mixed. And even though chronic disease is what most Americans will eventually succumb to, so most individuals in our world are dying, or in the U.S. are dying of chronic diseases. Proactive and preventative healthcare has worked for a long time for many bacterial and infectious diseases through things like public health measures. This would be a great example is wash your hands. And so a public health measure would be like, putting the little signs up in the bathrooms that say, hand washing prevents the spread of disease. Or the news, reporters reminding people in cold and flu season that the best thing you can do, or the easiest thing you can do, is wash your hands regularly. That's actually a preventative approach that we take for infectious disease, and it works really well. Immunizations also work really well. It has even eradicated, if you remember smallpox, has even eradicated a very, very deadly disease. We also do something like the epidemiology is the the tracking of diseases. And so we have a system of reporting and tracking diseases. And if you'll remember back to the exceptions to HIPAA, there's a long list of infectious diseases that get reported to mostly the county health department, but sometimes nationally. So like tuberculosis gets reported because you are not supposed to fly if you have active tuberculosis. So we report and track lots of diseases. This is a wonderful way to help prevent disease. For instance, E. coli or salmonella. Why would we report that? Well, we can figure out if it's coming from a food source. And if it is coming from a food source, or if we think it's coming from a food source, we can pull that food off the shelves. So it prevents infectious disease. It works really well. So it is less expensive and more effective in the long run, and it is even more effective and less expensive in the long run for chronic disease. When I say chronic disease, of course, what I'm talking about are our traditional lifestyle-related diseases, heart disease, cancer, upper respiratory diseases, kidney disease, type 2 diabetes. All of these are chronic in nature, meaning typically once you get them, you are only managing them. You're not cured. So you want to prevent these for as long as possible. So this is proactive. This would be a proactive approach. Or a proactive approach would be doctors recommending exercise for the treatment of high blood pressure. And cholesterol, or diet modifications for, high cholesterol. We want to do proactive, preventative actions so that we can change this current model. It would require a lot of changes because we would have to teach people how to teach people to have preventative actions, like actually how to exercise and eat right and what that means. And then the hard part would be the convincing the public that it's better to live a healthy lifestyle than take pills and get surgeries at a young age. So that's the really tough part. It would have I would argue that in addition to being less expensive, economically, it would have benefits then, but we'd also have happier and healthier people. Happier, healthier, more productive people. I think that would probably result in tremendous social, economic, and emotional benefits for our country if we and the research is quite clear. Healthier individuals typically report higher quality of life, more production in their work and their lives. So it's really good if we can get people to live healthy lifestyles, not just from a healthcare perspective, but it will save us a lot of money in healthcare. Chances are you're a big proponent of the preventative model, I imagine, if you are in kinesiology. There's lots of other evidence that this works for other diseases and has. For instance, malaria. Malaria is still, all of these diseases actually are still present in our world. But for instance, malaria, we try to handle this by immunizations. So if you're traveling to an area that has a lot of malaria, get immunizations. And something as simple as mosquito nets, because obviously malaria is transmitted through mosquitoes or mosquito bites. So then if you prevent the bites, you prevent the malaria. Other things like measles and mumps, you've probably been vaccinated against these. It certainly works because we know, although it's becoming more prevalent now because people are not vaccinating their children. I lived in a childhood that was measles and mumps free. My dad didn't. My dad's probably a little older than your parents, and measles and mumps were still fairly common when he was a kid, even though he was vaccinated for it too. We do a much better job of vaccinating more people now, because that's the other thing. For vaccinations to really work on a very wide level, you have to have enough people vaccinated. Polio, the same thing. Tuberculosis, TB testing. So we do extensive TB testing in our society. So if you ever work in a school or a healthcare facility, you are tested for TB, so that we know individuals who test positive are not coming in contact in medical environments with individuals. And the bubonic plague. Obviously the Black Death. Yes, it's still around today. But what we figured out, or what individuals figured out in the Dark Ages, is where it was coming from. And once they figured out it was coming from the fleas on the rats, they got rid of the rats. And that actually got rid of the disease. Or to the point where it wasn't killing, hundreds of thousands of people. So we do reactive healthcare for a lot of chronic disease, or like I said, chronic disease being these diseases that are often lifestyle related. So hypokinetic, also meaning low physical activity. So we do very little. We try. Don't get me wrong. I think we're trying now, but we're trying to do more because in the past we've done very little to prevent things like obesity and cardiovascular disease and cancer, diabetes, osteoporosis, and stroke. And cardiovascular disease and cancer actually will end up killing over 75% of the U.S. population. Cardiovascular disease being the number one killer, cancer being number two. So if we can prevent these or postpone them till late in life, it will be much better off. But the reactive disease-oriented model is actually easier, right? You live your life however you want, and then when something happens, then you seek advice. And it may or may not be too late. So it's easy. It's well established. It even works for infectious disease. If you have bronchitis, or you have, a cut that gets infected, we can put some antibacterial cream. We can prescribe antibiotics, depending on if it's bacterial, and be good to go. And traumatic injuries, right? You break your arm, we can set your arm, we can cast it. So we can react to things, and it works for infectious disease, traumatic injuries. but it's not very effective for chronic degenerative hypokinetic diseases. And when I say effective, I mean, sure, medical technology can, we can do angioplasty, we can clean out your arteries, we can do open heart surgery, but that's not the best way to handle it. Typically, when people have angioplasty, it's not a one and done. It's continual follow-ups for the rest of their lives. Once you have a heart attack, you're seeing the cardiologist every year, doing testing. So that's not very efficient. It wouldn't be so much better. It would be so much better to prevent this as long as possible. So based on the fact that most disease today are chronic and degenerative, and chronic and degenerative diseases are nearly impossible to cure, can only be managed at great expense, then really it makes good sense to be preventative. So I know this is ethics, and I know I'm pushing for the preventative model. Now that's my nature and that's my bias, because the statistics are outstanding. So per person in the U.S., we spend over $8,000 per person, which means that our total health expenditures are in the trillions, and we spend 18% of our GDP on health. Most of it is spent managing chronic disease. Chronic disease is related to lifestyle choices. Primarily, the big four are not exercising or low fitness, smoking, excessive drinking, and poor diet. Those are kind of the big four. Those lifestyle choices, or poor lifestyle choices, account for about 70% of healthcare spending in this country. So yes, I do have a bias about this. And so yeah, you probably for the last 10 minutes you're going, yeah, I can feel her angst about this. Yeah, you're probably right. So here's the ethics part. So here, again, this is, if we're talking about allocation of healthcare resources, we're looking at reactive model and we're looking at preventative model. Who should receive the care? An example, what about someone who caused their own disease, or probably caused their own disease, because disease is multifaceted. But let's say some individual who has lived really bad, really unhealthfully for a long time, and now they have cardiovascular disease. Do we treat them equally? Do we not? And maybe we do treat them equally. I'm being kind of the devil's advocate here. I'm not arguing for or against at all. But who pays for it then? So let's say, okay, yeah, they do have heart disease. Do they pay more? Do we let the government pay for their treatment if they have Medicare? These are the kind of questions that are ethical in nature. So who should receive care? Everyone equally? There are healthcare models, like in Canada, that attempt to do that. Our healthcare model is not that way. We have a privatized system where in Canada they have a social healthcare system, meaning that everyone in the country, or that is a citizen of Canada, receives the same healthcare package. The old and sick, should those individuals receive care? Or only the young and the healthy? The wealthy, sports stars and athletes? It doesn't take much to see that there's some real differences in how some individuals are treated. Certainly. I'm not saying, like I said, I'm not arguing for or against any one of these bullet points. Just asking you to think about this. And chances are you have seen instances where things like sports stars and athletes, they're getting MRIs during halftime. And, if you need an MRI for your knee injury, could be weeks, months, while you wait for insurance to approve, your physician's request. So just something to think about. All right, moving on. A few more things here. People do have actually the right to refuse treatment. So somebody can reject a recommended course of treatment. However, when someone does refuse care, they must be deemed competent to do so. So there are instances in which individuals are deemed incompetent, and then other individuals are going to make their healthcare choices for them. But check this out. Once a patient or a client decides to refuse care, you cannot treat them if they're competent. And this has become a legal matter in many ways. And it has been upheld by the Supreme Court in many cases. And what they typically have done is what they kind of call a balancing test to determine if they should override a competent person's decision. So is this preserving their life? Are they protecting other people? Are they preventing what they deem a suicide? But for the most part, the Supreme Court has upheld competent individuals' right to refuse health care. And there are instances in which individuals have tried to continue to treat. And you can be charged with assault and battery if you continue to attempt to treat after refusal. In the workplace, then, it's probably, there are many of you will go into careers that will have medical records present. You all have a medical record too. And so if you think about your medical record, all the different places you've been and, maybe the different treatments you've sought out, what pieces of information are essential in ongoing care in your best interest? Just kind of think about that for a second. So if you are really any kind of health professional, you're keeping a medical record for somebody. And these are invaluable. These are really important. For you, and for especially a physician, but I know a lot of us are not going to be physicians, you can think about this for many different careers. But you can assess family medical history, you can compare progress or lost ground in treatment, clearly personal training, physical therapy, you can see that, I hope, prescribe appropriate treatment plans, offer advice, refer to specialists, and so on and so forth, and so down there you'll see. Think about your current job or chosen profession, and so obviously which ones are going to matter for your chosen profession? Probably all of them, honestly. All of these could probably be pretty valuable in a variety of healthcare settings. Your textbook uses your textbook author really does like acronyms, and I think they're great too. So think about medical records floating. You want them to be factual, legible, although electronic medical records are where most things are now. There's still people who are writing things down, so make sure they're legible. Objective, meaning that you are not infusing opinion or emotion. You're trying to make them as accurate and as timely as possible. And so it's actually important, depending on your day, it's best to write things down as soon as possible because as the time goes on, you will forget important facts. We like to think we won't, but we will. So again, medical records float. Factual, legible, objective, accurate, and timely. They're often, so with some of these considerations, I feel like, we certainly haven't done some of these topics justice, but that's the nature of this course. It's an introductory course. I want you to be aware of all of these different things. But clearly, some of these topics are extremely difficult. With the Terri Schiavo case is a perfect one, where it was 15 years from the time she collapsed to the time she actually died. And that was filled with a lot of arguments, appeals, and legal action. So anyways, with that being said, there are bodies of or groups of individuals that often take on cases that have ethical dilemmas in them. So a healthcare ethics committee is an advisory board, typically at a hospital. It may also be at like a large medical group. So you may be, obviously, you may have access to one if you are a physical therapist in a hospital or an occupational therapist in a large medical group or something like that. So this advisory board will have a group of individuals from, physicians, nurses, patient advocates, clergy is typically involved, legal counsel, professional ethicists, so the real experts that have thought about these or really studied these things. And so a healthcare ethics committee, well, the purpose of this group is to really facilitate discussion of ethical issues arising in the patient care setting. But what they do is they will lend support to families, patients, and decision makers. So they're not the end-all be-all. They'll review cases, they'll try to clarify situations that are either completely ethical in nature or legal or religious, but they're there for the rights of the patients and to promote fair policies and procedures. So they have to follow, it's not like they're not a jury, but they are reviewing these cases thoroughly and they're providing as much support as possible to make sure that this case receives its, full understanding. Don't forget about patient consent, because we're talking about medical ethics here. So informed consent, implied consent, you absolutely need consent to treat. And there's different types, or I should say, there's different types. Informed consent is someone has been told all about something and they agree. So this is the same in a care setting. So that we talked about it in terms of research. Informed consent in a care setting is you tell someone all about what you'd like to do for them or with them, and they agree. Or they imply consent. Like I said, if they're rolling up the sleeve to get the flu shot. Although you have to sign that away now too. Proof of consent. You can orally agree to course of treatment, but it's more difficult to corroborate, obviously meaning that if you have a legal case, oral proof of consent is nearly impossible to prove. It's a he said, she said. So, who do you want to believe? So it's not as binding as a written document, but there's no legal requirement that a patient's consent be in writing, but it's just smarter, in my opinion. So written consent, written proof of consent, means that there's actual proof there of agreement or of their wishes, and obviously can be used as a legal document if needed. There's one other type of proof of consent, which is emergency consent. If it is impossible to obtain consent and immediate treatment is needed, consent is implied. So what goes here? And so this goes beyond Good Samaritan laws. So we're talking about in a professional setting. In a professional setting, if there's a truly emergency situation, you assume that most people would agree to treatment. So that's emergency consent. So who can authorize consent? Obviously the person themselves, as long as they're competent. And an individual is considered competent really until a court decides otherwise. And so these individuals, if you're competent, you are believed to understand the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. Spouses can give consent if you are legally married. And that's what was happening in the Terri Schiavo case. He wanted to make that decision. She had no will or advance directives. And so he had the authority to give consent. You can also have guardianship or temporary guardianship if an individual is not competent, for whatever reason, mental, physical disabilities, then an individual can protect patients' rights and even manage the estate, meaning any of their assets, money, and such, taking care of a patient. Minors is a little different because in most states, you must obtain consent of a parent or guardian for treatment. But there are exceptions, and the last bullet point there I said in most states. There are exceptions. Some of these exceptions include seeking help for mental health reasons. So if you are under the age of 18, in many states, you can seek help from a mental health professional without the consent of your parents. In many states, including California, you can seek care under the age of 18 for reproductive health. So if you are a teenage individual and you would like information on birth control, you can do that without the consent of your parents. But for other things, they have to consent to treatment. Emergency situations when parents aren't present, you still can treat. If a minor is married or emancipated, then they are considered autonomous, competent adults. So it goes to spousal or self, not parent. And just to wrap up here, you might be thinking, we've talked about a lot of different things, and that's true. But here's some healthcare providers, or some sample healthcare providers, and some examples that of some maybe ethical and legal issues that may arise. So as a dietitian, perhaps you're a dietitian in a hospital or a long-term care facility, a retirement community, perhaps. Recognition of malnutrition may be something that you need to deal with. Personal trainers, consent, working with minors, disordered eating, overtraining, and all of these things, by the way, aren't just for these one, healthcare provider. These are just examples. Physical therapists, incorrectly interpreting doctor's orders, resident neglect, meaning, like I said, in those long-term care facilities, recognizing that. Physician assistant, negligent acts, meaning mistakes, for lack of a better term, and your presiding physicians may also be held negligent. So there you go, another whirlwind topic in ethics and physical activity and health. But as I've mentioned several times now, I want to bring up a lot of these issues so that you can recognize them. We're not going to probably find solutions for a lot of these, but be able to think a little bit more clearly and critically about them, and perhaps even where you stand with these may be helpful. So dig back into your materials and take care.